there are back-to-back incidents, Sabbath incidents in Matthew 12. The first is in the first 8 verses, and the second is in the next 5 or 6 verses 9 through 14. And we closed out last week looking at the matter of the disciples plucking the heads of grain. As they were walking through, and they plucked the heads of grain, and in all likelihood, we're talking about wheat, and just not a lot of wheat grown in this part of the world, but there is where I came from, and you can walk through and just grab a handful of heads of wheat, and you can rub them in between your hands and blow them out, and you blow the husks off, and you've got just a small handful of grain there to eat. And so the disciples had plucked these grains of heads of wheat, and were eating them as they were walking through the fields or by the fields on the Sabbath. A lot of times these pathways would just be small, narrow pathways, maybe not even any wider than the area between these rows of pews. And people, the grain would literally be right along the side of the walkway or the path, and one could just reach out as he walked and eat and maybe get another bite along the way. And the Pharisees condemned the disciples for doing what was not lawful to do on the Sabbath. And we noted that there was no violation of the Sabbath involved in this situation. That the law regarding the Sabbath was to do no customary work, or to do no work on the Sabbath day, and to pluck the heads of grain and rub your hands together to eat the grain was certainly no violation of the Sabbath, as is evidenced by what Jesus said at the very end of the text in verse number 7. But we talked at some length about how the Pharisees, or how the Jews, or the Jewish leaders over the course of time, had built this series of hedges around the law of Moses. And that the law of Moses was a bullseye, and then all the circles around the bullseye were the hedges. And they ruled in such a way as if you violated the hedge, you violated the bullseye. And that was certainly not the case. And they had made their traditions, their traditions exceeded the law. Said, you've made the law of God by none effect because of your traditions, Jesus said in Matthew 15. And so we have these situations on the Sabbath in Matthew 15. The first one is here, and also I want us to note again verse 7 that Jesus said, "If you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless." Guiltless. And that's a very important word, because guiltless means without guilt. In other words, they had not violated any law of Moses. All right. In addition to that, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but we'll see it again in this next section in verses 9 through 14, where there's a supposed violation of the Sabbath. But just keep in mind that what the disciples had done was not a violation of the Sabbath, and Jesus gave a citation in regard to that with reference to David back in 1 Samuel 21. When David was on the run from Saul, he and his men were on the run, and they came to a place of worship to a man by the name of Abiathar the priest. And Abiathar the priest gave David and his men the bread from the table of showbread that was only to be eaten by the priests. And yet Abiathar understood that it would be all right, given some conditions, for David and those men to take the loaves of bread from the table of showbread, which he did. And nobody ever condemned David for it. And that's what really Jesus is talking about. It says, David ate bread that only the priests were allowed to eat. And none of you have ever condemned David for that. In other words, you're inconsistent in your application of the Scriptures. In other words, you're holding my disciples to one standard, and you're holding David to a completely separate standard, and basically you've missed the boat. You've missed the boat. All right? And so, sir.
Doesn't the Scriptures call that they atonement?
Just depends. It depends on what translation you're reading.
It looks like it's been easier to put their atonement and eat off of that.
It probably would, but I don't know that was the case. The case here. One thing I'd want to know is I'd want to know what time of the year it was. If it was in the spring, it would have to be wheat, and it wouldn't be corn until the fall or late summer because of the growth, the time of growth. All right, so now let's move on down to verse number 9, and this is on the next, or the top of the next page, with regard to the man with the withered hand. Just by way of review, why do you think Jesus, why do you think Matthew records Jesus as quoting Micah 6:6-8, and Mark and Luke did not quote Micah 6:6-8? See, the statement made in Matthew 12 and verse 7, if you had known what it says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. Jesus quotes Micah 6 and the context of verses 6-8. But Mark makes no reference to it whatsoever, and Luke makes no reference to it whatsoever. What might be the reason for Matthew's account quoting Micah and Mark and Luke not quoting Micah? Who he's talking to? Who's Matthew's gospel written to? Jews. And Mark's was written to Romans, and Luke's was written to Gentiles. And so Mark's audience and Luke's audience wouldn't have had any familiarity whatsoever with what was said in Micah 6:6-8. But Matthew's audience would have been very familiar with Micah 6:6-8. As Paul said, I'm just trying to stir up your pure minds by way of remembrance. To misuse a passage that take a passage that Paul used out of context and apply it to this audience. But it's always good to be reminded of why some of these accounts are different than others. Some contain more and some contain less. And again, I said, why do you think Matthew did that? Now, I can't prove that's why, but I think that's why. Because Matthew's audience was a Jewish audience. All right, so now, Matthew 12:9-14. Now when he had departed from there, he went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand. And they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. Then he said to them, what man is there among you who has one sheep, and it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore it is what? Lawful to do what? To do good on the Sabbath. It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Now they asked him about the man with the withered hand, right? But he responded by giving what as an example? A sheep or an ox, right? That's in the ditch. And what he appears to be doing here is that he's quoting their tradition. Again, there's nothing in the old law that I know of that makes this exception. But the exception is, it's obvious to anybody that if your ox is in the ditch on the Sabbath day, you can go get him out. We don't have to argue or explain that. And so And so what I suspect is that the Jews had written that exception in their hedges. All right. So in other words, they're asking, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, which is something nobody ever did because people weren't doing what Jesus had been doing. There'd been a long space of no miracles being performed. All right. And so, and certainly not on the scale that we see the miracles that Jesus performed. All right? It's not like the Old Testament prophets went everywhere just performing miracles all the time. Now, there are miracles in the Old Testament, people being raised from the dead in the Old Testament. But man, Jesus is just going everywhere, and it's just like a multitude of miracles. So there was no hedge for working miracles on the Sabbath, you see, because that just didn't happen. And so Jesus goes beyond, they're asking about healing a man. He goes beyond, talks about their hedge. And he says, if your hedge allows you to pull an ox out of the ditch or a sheep out of the ditch on the Sabbath day, then it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. You see, note he says it's lawful, not just permissible, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And then he says, verse 13, to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him. Isn't that interesting? Did Jesus say anything specific about healing that dude? What's the Bible say that he said? Stretch out your hand. Stretch out your hand. And so when he stretched out his hand, what happened? It was just like the other, right? So they surmised that Jesus did it. Isn't that interesting? Jesus didn't say to the man, hey, I'm fixing to heal your hand, stretch it out here so I can put my hand on it. Or stretch it out here so I can spit on it. Or I can spit and rub some dirt on it. Not like the blind man in John 9, or even not like the man in John 5 when he said, take up your bed and walk, because that guy couldn't walk. Remember? We talked about him last week, I believe it was in John 5. All Jesus said was stretch out your hand. And then there it is. So then they immediately concluded that Jesus did it, which they were right in that conclusion. But my question would be, how could they prove that? How could they prove Jesus did it? I know that sounds crazy to think about, right? But to me, it would seem to be an interesting argument for them to try to take Jesus to court over this matter. Because then they would have to admit that he did what? That he did a miracle. And if he did a miracle, there you go, Sean. Thank you. It's confirmation he's sent by God. All right, but what do they do? Well, we're going to destroy him over this man whose hand was withered, and now it's been restored. Now, I want to note something. I came across this. I came across this in my studies and preparation, and that is this. And I really don't even know how to. I don't even know how to word it. But we might say exceptions to. In other words, there were understood, or there are understood exceptions to laws. Okay, there are understood exceptions to laws. All right, and one would be the law of necessity. The law of necessity. All right. And that's what David did, right? That's what Abiathar did with David. The law of necessity exceeded the law about who could eat the bread. Is that right? In other words, there was an immediate need that needed to be met, And Abiathar the priest, God's chosen representative, said, you can eat this bread under these conditions. And David said, the conditions are met. He gave him the bread, the law of necessity. All right? And we might also call it the ox in the ditch. You know, the ox in the ditch, the law of necessity. All right? Then there's second is that there may be a superior law that comes into play. All right, for example, I'm sure in the course of our 270 some odd year history as a nation, that certain states have passed certain laws within those states that the Supreme Court has struck down as being unconstitutional. Right? All right, so the law of the state is exceeded by what? The law of the federal government. In other words, there's a superior court or a superior lawmaking body that supersedes that which exists at the state level. All right, and so there could be a superior law that comes into effect. And then there is third, the law of charity or the law of mercy. The law of charity or the law of mercy. And I was trying to think about maybe an example of this. Of course, I think obviously what we're talking about here in the withered hand situation is certainly a law of mercy. It's not a law of necessity. In other words, the man's hand didn't require healing. But mercy says, if you can do it, you do it. Okay? The law of mercy. I thought maybe in the account, and by the way, this is obviously it's a parable, the parable of the what we call the Good Samaritan. You know, where two guys passed by on the other side. You remember? The first one was what? Parable of the Good Samaritan. Man's lying on the side of the road. First man approaches him. What does the Bible say he is? He's a priest. And the second guy passes by on the other side, and what does it say of him? He's yeah, but more than that. He's a Levite. All right? The priest passed by on the other side, and Levite passed by on the other side. All right? It may have, well, what? Yeah, and Levite is, yeah, and that's what I was getting at. The Levite is the priestly tribe. All right? It may have been that those guys were on their way to perform some priestly duty. In other words, there may have been some reason for them to be traveling that had to do with their either priestly or Levitical duty. And they thought that was more important than stopping to help this Jewish man. All right? So the law of charity or the law of mercy. I mean, let me just give you an example. Let's just say I lived as far away from the building as, well, I won't use me. I'll just use Vince. All right? Vince drives pretty good ways to get here. All right? Let's say that at some point on a Sunday morning, Vince is on the road and he comes up on a vehicle that's off the side of the road and he can see somebody that's in there off the side of the road. When I mean off the side of the road, I don't mean just simply on the shoulder. I mean somebody that has run off the road and crashed their vehicle. And he's the first man, the first person to come up on this accident. All right? So now Vince has a choice to make. Do I pass by on the other side so that I'm not late for worship? Or do I stop and try to help this person, in all likelihood making me late for worship, potentially causing me to miss Sunday assembly altogether? What's the right thing for Vince to do? I think we're all in agreement that Vince should stop, right? And I'm pretty sure Vince would stop. In fact, if Vince came to church one morning and told me that he passed by somebody in a wreck so that he wouldn't be late for Bible class, I would rebuke him. I would. All right, so the law of mercy tells us. But what's the command for Christians on the first day of the week? What's the command for Christians on the first day of the week? To assemble. But the law of mercy says events need to stop. And not one person among us would think anything about it if he stopped and helped somebody, right? And was late or missed it altogether. Right? That's the law of mercy. Law of mercy supersedes the law of mercy supersedes what we would call the law in principle. All right? Then there's a fourth exception. There's a fourth exception. And the fourth exception is higher authority. In other words, the authority of the lawgiver. Right? In other words, the man who makes the laws has the authority to do what? Change them or do what? Make exceptions. Right? The man who makes the laws, or the person, in this case Christ, he's the Lord of the Sabbath, right? If he's Lord of the Sabbath, that means that he gets to make the rules about the Sabbath, right? And so in essence what he's saying is, even if these men were violating the law of the Sabbath by eating this grain, I've got the authority to tell them they can do it. Is that true or not true? It's true. So there's four exceptions to there are four, we say, generally not argued exceptions to the law or to the principle of law. One is the law of necessity. The second is the presence of a superior law. The third is the law of charity or mercy. And then the last is the law of higher authority. Actually, I should say it this way: the authority of the lawgiver. The authority of the lawgiver. All right? And so, by the way, and Jesus, if we read all the accounts where Jesus has something going on the Sabbath, and he invokes all four of these. He invokes all four of these. He invoked himself as the authority. He invoked the law of mercy. He invoked the law of necessity. But no, he didn't invoke, I don't think he invoked superior law, did he? Well, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. That'd probably be the law of mercy. I'm trying to think. Maybe he didn't invoke the law of superior law. Well, he invoked three of the four. We know that for certain, and we understand obviously the superior law argument will work. All right, now middle part of the second page. Middle part of the second page. How to study a topic. Okay, in other words, how to draw a reasonable conclusion when certain things are under consideration. And let's see, 1, 2, 3. The third paragraph begins with how we study a topic. Falls into an area of study known as hermeneutics. All right. The definition of hermeneutics is the branch of knowledge that deals with interpretation, especially of the Bible or other. It says literary texts. I would say authoritative texts. All right. Because hermeneutics simply means principles of interpretation. All right. And the Bible requires, you have to interpret the Bible, right? There has to be some principle of interpretation for the Bible. All right. By the way, the Constitution is the same way. There are two schools of thought in our country with regard to the Constitution of the United States. There are those of us who believe in what's called originalism, which means we believe that it means what it says and it means what it said when they wrote it. Right? What part, as sometimes we like to say, what part of shall not be infringed do you not understand? A lot of us believe that the Constitution should be interpreted in the way that it was intended when the authors wrote it. Right? Then there are other people that believe that that the Constitution needs to be interpreted in light of the present social structure. Right? But the truth of the matter is, if that's the way that it's interpreted, then it really doesn't mean anything. All right? Bible's the same way. You know, the Bible needs to be interpreted in the way that it was written and understood in the time in which it was written. Right? And not in view of what the current social thinking is. I mean, look at it. I mean, look at what denominationalism has done with regard to the interpretation of the Bible. They've all abandoned the Bible truth on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. All of them. They've all abandoned it. But why did they abandon it? Why did massive swaths of denominationalism abandon the Bible teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage? Yeah, what? Yeah, because divorce became extremely prominent and accepted in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. And so the more divorce there was, then churches found out that they couldn't maintain their numbers if they only permitted people to be members that were in keeping with what the Bible teaches about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. So they abandoned the Bible teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage because of the social structure. All right, well, before that, it was the matter of women's in leadership. When did women's preachers become a thing? No, not until the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and on up to now. And then chasing the feminist movement is the homosexual movement. And by the way, there are a lot of people, even in the church, that are starting to vacillate on the homosexual issue. Now that's no worse than any of the others, but what I'm just telling you is it's here. All right? Now what's on the heels of the homosexual movement? That's right, the alphabet mafia. The alphabet mafia. And listen, I just shudder to think what's going to be after that. I mean, it's almost like you think, man, it can't get any worse. It's like, guess what? It can get worse. And it's getting worse. It's getting worse. But why are churches abandoning the Bible teaching on this? Because they're allowing their teaching to be influenced by what's called the zeitgeist, or the thought of the day. In other words, the spirit or the way people think in the current time. And thus they've just thrown the scriptures into the wind. All right, but the Bible has to be, look, if the Bible doesn't mean what it said 2,000 years ago, it doesn't mean anything. It's just like the Constitution. If the Constitution doesn't mean what it doesn't mean what it meant, in 1789 or whatever year it was ratified, if it doesn't mean what it meant then, it doesn't mean anything at all. And if the Bible doesn't mean what it meant and said 2,000 years ago, then it doesn't mean anything today.
It just tells you about the mindset of where we are right now, because, like you said, the Constitution was signed over 200 years ago, and society has changed over those 200 years, but now we want to change it.
Right.
Nobody was wanting to change it when I was a kid.
Right.
Because I never heard about it. And times were different then than they were 200 years ago.
Yeah, it managed to hold together pretty good for about 200 years, and now all of a sudden,
About 220, 30.
it's just got really bad lately. But yeah.
What I'm saying is we're just now wanting, in the last how many years, 10 years, 15, we're just now wanting to change it. But that's the mindset. That just shows you how the mindset has changed.
That's right. Yeah, the way people view the world has changed almost indescribably. in the last 20 or 25 years.
Just like the discussion we had last night, everything has to be changed to suit. Like we were talking about, I had a friend posted on social media that,
Puzzle piece.
she has an autistic son, and they've now declared the little puzzle piece that represents autism as being offensive. And so now they want to use the infinity sign for autism. Well, she doesn't find the puzzle piece offensive, but now, what about the people that don't find it offensive versus, it's like that with our school mascots, it's with everything. If it offends one person, we have to change it. Somebody on the Facebook thread said, well, I'm offended that she's not offended.
Right there's the answer, Tom.
What's that?
People's always been evil. There's always been different people. Social media has brought the groups together to do what's happening now.
I think you're exactly right.
You're right.
That's a catalyst. It's a forum. It's a forum for like-minded.
I mean, you had gays and Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah. You're right. I mean, yeah.
20 years ago, we didn't know what was happening in Hackleburg, unless we went there.
Right.
Now we know what's happening on the other side of the world.
That's exactly right. Yeah. The information age has not been particularly helpful to society, and the instant information age has really not been helpful. And by the way, just one quick reminder: Twitter is not a real place. All right, Twitter is not a real place.
It's not by Walmart.
No, it's not even by Dollar General. And it's hard to get somewhere that's not by Dollar General. Yeah, but people think just because 10 million people on Twitter say a thing that the whole country thinks that way, and it's just not true. But companies have bowed the knee to that kind of foolishness as if Twitter is a real place and that Twitter represents the mindset of most people, and they've caved to this insanity. And look, I wish every beer company would go out of business tomorrow, all right? But I'm glad to see Budweiser getting punished over that foolishness they started about 2 or 3 weeks ago.
I'm glad I quit 12 years ago.
I'm glad you said 12 and not a number less than 10.
But you know that right there goes back. So Tyson done something during the pandemic. And Mama was talking about boycotting Tyson.
Yeah.
I said, no, if you boycott Tyson, do you know what you're getting into? Well, that's just chicken. I said, no. They own Tennessee fried sausage.
Uh-oh, done gotten somebody's sausage bin.
Stepped on their toes when I said they own right bacon. You know, if you're going to do one, you got to do it all.
Right.
If you're going to boycott Budweiser, you got to get Levi's. You got to get Disney.
Yeah.
You got to get Target.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is I'm glad that people are pushing back.
Right.
It's really not about the beer. It's about people that people are pushing back against the insanity. What's that?
If you're going to do one, do it all.
That's right. I'm boycotting Bud Light, by the way. I'm boycotting. You'll never catch me with one of them in my hand. If you see me with an empty can of Bud Light, it's because I'm picking up garbage out here in the front of the church building. Is that the first or second? It's first? All right, thanks. All right, now. All right, now. The idea of interpretation. There are reasonable procedures to follow in interpreting the Bible. In other words, there are principles that can be followed for us to understand that what part of the Bible applies to us and what does not. And the reason this is important to me is because I've been engaged in a fairly protracted conversation with somebody who basically says, you're wrong in the way you interpret the Bible. There's no authority for you to interpret the Bible this way. And then my question is, well, by what authority do you condemn the way I interpret the Bible? And by what authority do you determine the way that you interpret the Bible is better than the way that I interpret the Bible? And guess what you get when you say something like that? Silence. Silence. Now look, the Bible itself uses principles of interpretation within the text itself. All right? For example, people say, well, you can't argue against silence. If the Bible doesn't say thou shalt not, then you can't say thou shalt not. You ever heard anything along those lines? If the Bible doesn't expressly forbid a thing, then you can't expressly forbid a thing. Except for the fact that in Hebrews 7 and verses 14 and following, in talking about the high priesthood, and that if Jesus was going to be the high priest, there had to be a change of the law. Because the Bible says Jesus came from the tribe of Judah. He goes, it's evident. It's evident that Jesus came from the tribe of Judah, of which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning the priesthood. In other words, the law of Moses didn't say anything about anybody from Judah serving in the priesthood, pro or con. And yet every Jew understood that if you were from the tribe of Judah, you couldn't be a priest. Why? Because God specified the tribe of Levi. In other words, when God designated Levi as the priestly tribe, he did so to the exclusion of all the other tribes, and he didn't have to list them one by one to eliminate them. And the Hebrews writer cites that. He says, the argument of the priesthood is an argument from silence. The Bible says nothing about Judah serving as priests. Therefore, because God has spoken with regard to the priesthood, Judah is out. And if Jesus is going to be a priest, there has to be a change in the law. And that was another thing. The same person said, he goes, by what authority do you declare that the Old Testament's not for us today? I said, the same argument that says that Jesus can't be the priest. If there's going to be a change in the priesthood, there has to be a change in the law. And when you take a law or a covenant or a will, if you will, and make a new one, it automatically invalidates the one before. I've told y'all this before. My mom and Freeman had a will. Scott drew up a will for my folks a number of years ago. All right? I've got a copy of that will in my safe deposit box. All right? Unbeknownst to me and my brother, some things, they had written another will. Now, the only reason we knew they had another will is because some things had changed in our family. Like, I bought that house. And the house was in the first will. So some things changed, all right? And so Mom and Freeman thought it best to change their will to take the house out of it since the house had been sold. Well, Paulie and I were talking together, like, hey man, we need to talk to Mom about their will. Because the house is in the old will and there's all this. So we go to talk to them. And they say, oh yeah, we changed the will last year. We had a new will written up last year. Me and Paulie neither one had any idea. But the point is this. What's that will worth that's in my safe deposit box? It ain't worth the paper it's printed on. Why? Because a new one, and by the way, the wills are almost identical. Almost identical. Matter of fact, 95% of those two wills are identical. But the date on the latter one nullifies the date on the earlier one, right? And it's completely done away with, right? And so when the Bible says that in order for there to be a high priesthood for Jesus, the law had to be changed, every bit of that law was done away with when the new one came into effect, right? So again, there's some very clear principles of interpretation that we could use. And I could spend, and I may come back, matter of fact, I may come back the week after our meeting and spend a little bit of time with this before we start lesson 20, because principles of interpretation are vitally important for us as we study and as we study with others.